I never thought I'd have the opportunity to talk about this story publicly, but since I no longer work with the guy in question and he no longer follows me on Instagram, I think it's safe to spill the tea. A lot of my work bros already know some of the story and encourage me to tell it here, so here goes. There was a strange and confusing time in my life after a couple of crappy relationships that ended in a year-long period of celibacy, during which time I had mostly become jaded on the idea of sex and relationships. Then came the summer of 2021. At the age of 33, I met a 22-year-old coworker at my previous delivery station who, to paraphrase Steven Tyler, was a high school loser, never made it with the ladies. And this is the story of how I taught him how to walk this way. I mentioned in a previous video that I'd had a crush on a younger coworker that went horribly awry, and that there was another guy at work who was vaguely interested in me. Well, that didn't go anywhere romantically. He took a lot of voluntary time off work and just kind of dropped off my radar, and there's nothing wrong with that. We ended up being friends and achieving our respective goals elsewhere. But when he was out of sight and out of mind, one of the new hires ended up catching my eye. He was even younger than my previous crush, and given what had happened there, I was obviously hesitant to say anything. But I liked being around him, and I figured I'd just ride the high while it lasted. I don't really know what drew me into him, but I've noticed in hindsight that I tend to develop strong crushes only when everything else in my life is going to hell, so I'm getting ahead of myself here. Anyway, as I mentioned in my last Storytime video, I told a lot of other coworkers about what happened with my old crush rejected me over our age difference. Well, that ended up being a huge mistake, because after that, all these random new hires between the ages of 19 and 23 started hanging around me at break, and one of them was this new crush. We seemed to vibe pretty well, but there was another new coworker who seemed hell-bent on inserting himself into our one-on-one conversations. I call him Frito Gordito because he eventually became an embarrassing Mexican stereotype. Though at the time, he was different from most of the Mexican-American dudes I was used to in my area. He expressed interest in Lovecraft and rave music, he was a pretty talented artist, and he understood mental health issues better than a lot of other people around me at the time. In spite of him inadvertently cock-blocking me around my new crush, I actually did think he was pretty cool. I enjoyed conversing with him as well. I remember one night when I was showing my Instagram art to my crush, Frito jumped in out of nowhere and hijacked the conversation as usual, showing us his own art on Instagram. He and I ended up following each other, and he ended up DMing me a while later as I was waiting for my Lyft to take me home in the morning. While he seemed confident enough in person, through text he was kinda awkward in a cute way. We would talk about work and dark humor, and we started to bond over our shared mental health struggles. He also casually dropped the knowledge that he was still a virgin, which kinda surprised me considering he presented like a self-assured cholo at work. But upon closer examination, I realized that the one topic he always went radio silent on in public was anything to do with sex or relationships. I also thought it was kind of odd that he mentioned this to me at random, but I realized later at the time he had me on Instagram, I'd shared a link to one of my videos where I mentioned I'm cool with virgins, and I wonder if that had something to do with it. Either way, I didn't say anything to him one way or the other regarding this information, and I was still infatuated with my new crush, so Frito wasn't on my radar. The next time I saw Frito at work, he greeted me with a hug on our first break. I'm cool with hugging people, but I was a little taken aback by the action, especially since he did it right in front of my crush. He gave my crush a fist bump to make it seem like he was just generally being friendly, though. He did ask after the fact if it was okay for him to do that. I responded that it was alright. And after work he messaged me saying that if I ever wanted a hug from him, I was always welcome to ask. I noticed he started making subtle comments about how much he enjoyed talking to me, and I was beginning to suspect he had a bit of a crush on me, but I chose not to acknowledge it, and I continued to feign obliviousness. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't attracted to him at some level. I mean, I've never been one of those types who only obsesses over one person at a time. But I was more interested in getting to know my crush better, even though I wasn't planning to act on anything. But soon, that was going to backfire. I remember showing up early for work, as usual, sitting outside on the bench while my friends and I usually took our breaks, and my crush showed up a little while later. We got to chat for a bit, which I enjoyed, but then a bunch of other work acquaintances showed up. One of these was actually the close friend of my previous crush, who I'm going to nickname Sid because one of my former coworkers pointed out that he looks like Sid from Toy Story, and I'll never unsee it. Anyway, Sid was a pretty nice guy, but I always got kind of a weird vibe off of him, and in retrospect I think he also might have been a little interested in me at one point, but I just never picked up on it in time. Sid himself wasn't exactly the best at reading the room. He'd consistently broken up moments between me and my previous crush where I was certain something was going to happen between us, and now it was about to happen again with my new crush. Anyway, Sid and the other guys immediately started socializing, more or less ignoring me and my nonplussed expression. But then, Sid had a rare moment of clarity, and as he realized what was going on, he straightened up, looked at me, and then my crush, and then said slowly, "I'm sorry for interrupting you." In my head, I was thinking, "Shut up, Sid, shut the hell up." But outwardly, I feigned ignorance, and I told him he wasn't interrupting anything. But Sid, insistent on making things obvious, reiterated, "No, I mean, I'm sorry for interrupting you." At that point, it was time to clock in, so I excused myself, knowing full well that my secret was out and that Sid was going to say something to my crush about the situation. That was on a Monday, which was my crush's Friday. His shift was a day off of mine, which meant his work week would start the day before mine, and unfortunately, Sid had the same schedule as my crush, which gave them a whole day to potentially talk about me when I wasn't around. It didn't really matter to me if my crush had no interest in me outside of friendship, but I would have been really upset if our friendship ended because he thought I was a creep, as had happened with the guy before him, and I started to wonder what the hell was wrong with me that had made me this crazy. I talked to Frito some more during my downtime, but I didn't mention any of this to him. Well, I felt close enough to not have to censor myself around him. I didn't really want him involved in that situation at any level. I knew the situation was out of my control, but I tried not to think about it over the next few nights. But unfortunately, when I saw my crush again, he seemed a bit distant from me, although he remained cordial as always. I figured he was just in a mood or something. I mean, it happens. By the time Sunday night rolled around, I knew something was wrong. Now, back then, there were a number of factors contributing to my declining mental health that I'll get into in a more serious video, most of which had to do with the social climate at work. And after that incident, it was even worse, because now my crush seemed different around me, and I was certain it was because Sid opened his mouth and made the situation awkward. I was furious, and I took out my frustration on both the boxes I was unloading and Frito, who was staffed as my water spider. I ended up explaining the situation to Frito, who condescendingly dismissed my crush as being just a kid, despite only being 3 years older than him, and tried to help me feel better. I remembered what Frito had said previously about being willing to give me a hug anytime I wanted one, so I went ahead and I asked for one. After hugging him, I felt somewhat better and made it through the entire shift despite not talking to my crush much the rest of the night. After work, I asked Sid if he had said anything to my crush to make him distance himself from me, but he denied it and insisted that he hadn't talked to my crush much that week. I didn't believe him, but I left it alone and went home with the intention of sleeping away my misery. And then Frito DM'd me. He started off just checking in on me since I'd had a crappy night, but then he reflected on me hugging him and it started to become clear that he was attracted to me. At first I ignored his comments about how he wanted to hold me and make me feel safe because I didn't want to lead him on, but at that point he already knew I liked someone else and wasn't deterred by it, so I figured this guy knows what he's getting into. Finally, he mentioned in a roundabout way that he would be interested in screwing me if I was down for it, and I responded with the same indifferent line my old crush had used on me. It's not like I haven't thought about it. I mean, we seemed to vibe well enough that I was entertaining the thought, and I figured that maybe going over a year without getting laid was the thing that was messing me up in the first place. We talked a little about our respective insecurities, and he said that he'd do me right then and there if he could. I pointed out that I was home alone, and to my surprise he was actually serious enough that he was willing to hop in an Uber and come over. I was tired, and I knew it probably wasn't the best idea for a number of reasons, but I figured it was what we both needed for the time being. Now, I'm not going to get into the X-rated details, though I'm not above putting them behind a paywall if there's a demand for it. But once we got past the awkward attempt at foreplay, it was interesting. I mean, I didn't hate it. Once I realized that he got all his understanding of sex from porn, it kinda took me out of it. I'm actually pretty vanilla for the most part. But one thing I do enjoy is letting experienced guys experiment with me, even if it's stuff I'm normally not too excited about. So I mostly just rode that high to keep me going. He also had a habit of saying stupid stuff in the heat of passion, which I'll get more into later, but I stayed polite with him because I didn't want to break his confidence. And that's probably where I screwed up. Still, I accomplished what I'd hoped to do. I completely got over my crush on the other guy. Frito seemed rather proud of himself as well, commenting that the guy who had previously rejected me could never dare to do what we did. He seemed to have a strange newfound confidence in himself that wasn't there before. After taking a rather long shower with him, he left and I finally passed out from exhaustion. I went into work that night running on a dopamine high and 3 hours of sleep, but I made it through the shift. One of my work friends, who was taking me home that morning, saw the hickeys on my neck that I had apparently failed to hide and immediately realized I had broken my dry spell. I didn't tell her outright who it was, just that it was one of the guys who usually hangs out with us on breaks. Frito was literally the last one she thought of. Outside of that, I didn't tell anyone else right away, especially not Frito's brother, who worked with us. Frito was there that night, of course, since he didn't work Mondays, but he had taken an extra shift the next night, and when I encountered him at break, I couldn't even look him in the eyes. We sat next to each other in awkward silence as we listened to the conversations of the rest of our work buddies. But once we were off the clock and in our respective homes, we were back in each other's DMs talking dirty. I mean, yeah, he was kind of a weird dude. But like I said, it was fun for what it was worth, and I agreed to screw him again the following Monday morning after work. We kept up the flirting online, but I also started to notice that he was starting to call me pet names and open up more about his personal life. I got the vibe that he was starting to catch feelings for me outside of the whip appeal that we had going on, and that kind of made me uncomfortable because it wasn't what I had signed on for. He seemed more motivated about his life, and he was even talking about keeping our situation going after he moved out to San Diego to start college. I didn't want to be a jerk, so I gave some thought, and I decided that if he wanted to make a move and get closer, I could be okay with that. I felt like I was starting to lose friends at work for one reason or another, and talking to him was one of the few things that kept me grounded in that moment. Finally, Sunday night rolled around. For some reason, they decided to staff me to water spider that night, even though I had very little experience with it. I felt insecure and rushed, and finally had a nervous breakdown inside one of the trailers when I was sent to fold go-karts. Frito, who was also water spider that night, came looking for me to make sure I was okay. He gave me a hug and squeezed my butt for good measure, then sent our manager in to give me a pep talk. I did better after that, and after lunch, we ended up getting staffed across from each other on Pick to Buffer during the second half of the night. He was working directly next to this one girl, and they were talking about dogs or something casual. I forget exactly. But this new chick happened to be the new crush of the guy who rejected me in the previous video. I made a joke to Frito about cucking the guy in question, but it seemed to go over his head, so I left it alone. Whenever people were at earshot, though, he was hyping me up for what he was going to do later, and that got me through the rest of that otherwise crappy shift. When I got home, I checked to make sure Frito was still on for our rendezvous. He was, but he had to wait for his brother to go to bed so he could sneak away without the dude asking questions. I ended up falling asleep while he was waiting for a lift, and he had to call me through Instagram to wake me up when he arrived. We got down to business again, which is no better or worse than before, though I made sure to wrap things up more quickly so I could get some sleep for my shift later that day. But not even 2 minutes after we were done, while we were still lying in bed together, Frito stared blankly into the ceiling and asked me, "Once this fling is over, will you ignore me like you ignore," and then name-dropped the coworker from the previous video who rejected me, not the other way around. I was pretty shocked by this out-of-pocket question and simply replied no. But Frito continued prattling on, spilling enough spaghetti out of his pocket to feed 3 generations of Italians. He started talking about how the guy in question wasn't all that bad. And he brought up my joke from the previous night about that one chick, mistaking my put-down of my former crush as jealousy. Incidentally, she ended up getting into a relationship with Sid a few months later, which is hilarious in hindsight. But in that moment, I was becoming increasingly pissed off at Frito. It took every ounce of willpower not to kick his fat ass out of my apartment. He also said that if people at work knew that we were screwing, they would probably say he could do better, which was rich coming from a guy who spent most of his adult life yammed on Molly at raves and couldn't even manage to lose his virginity by accident. It was almost as though he was intentionally sabotaging our arrangement out of fear of his own feelings. But I'd already played that game enough in my 20s, and I didn't have the patience to deal with that crap anymore. So after humoring his ramblings, then through another long shower, dressing, and seeing him off to his lift, I messaged him telling him that I was no longer interested in continuing the arrangement. I didn't really want to end it that soon, but I had enough problems in my life already. He seemed cool about it, so I figured he didn't care that much after all. After that, I ended up taking some time off work for mental health reasons. This is a whole story in and of itself that I will be making into a longer, more serious video in the future, but I'm trying to keep this one lighter than my previous Storytime videos, so I'll leave it at that for now. Anyway, I had no intention of talking to Frito again after that, but he messaged me while I was out, and I resumed talking to him like we did in the beginning. When I went back to work, though, I noticed a drastic change in his demeanor from the last time I had seen him. He no longer paid any attention to the guys in our group, instead choosing to walk around conversing with every female unfortunate enough to cross his path, regardless of age or relationship status. Of course, I was the exception to that rule, but nobody seemed to question why I was the only woman at work he didn't talk to, despite supposed rumors from his own brother going around that there was something going on between us, which I don't think were actually circulating, but it was something Frito was paranoid about. With all the other fake friends ignoring me after my return, I decided to take VTO halfway through the shift and walk home, leaving a message on my Instagram stories for my workbros to let them know I wasn't going to kill myself or anything. The guy who had been my new crush prior to hooking up with Frito, who I'm going to refer to as my friend from this point forward since all that infatuation business is in the past, checked in on me, and I opened up to him about how annoying it was to see Frito strutting about the delivery station like Don Juan when he had no prior experience with women until 3 weeks earlier. My friend laughed because he knew exactly what I was talking about, saying that 3 weeks ago was exactly when Frito inexplicably changed, and I laughed too, and I started to feel better. My friend and I started to hang out and socialize more. Frito kept on trying and failing to gain female attention. There was one girl with a live-in boyfriend he seemed particularly sprung on, but she actually found him annoying, and I would sometimes hear her talking crap about him behind his back. I slowly revealed the story of Frito's confidence boost to various guy friends at work, and each time it was like an aha moment where they finally realized what flipped the switch on his personality. None of them ever confronted Frito about it, because we all kind of thought he was an idiot at that point, but we enjoyed a good laugh at his expense. Around October of 2021, I started getting close with yet another coworker, this one my age, who I actually did end up in a relationship with a month later. At the time of recording this, we're still together. He already knew the story about Frito Gordito, but neither of us was prepared for how weird Frito was going to be about our relationship. According to my boyfriend, Frito was working in proximity with him one night and inexplicably said, "I'm sorry I got in your way." At first he assumed it was work-related, but the context didn't merit the apology, so it came off as out of pocket. And I remember more than a few times where Frito would stand there watching me and my boyfriend being affectionate. Particularly this one time when I hugged him, and then Frito, who neither of us saw standing behind us, started mumbling something incoherently as he stared despondently through us. He still continued to ignore me in public, but he went out of his way to be cordial to my boyfriend, almost as though he felt threatened at some level. Which is odd, because Frito otherwise had started fully leaning into his wannabe hood rat persona, even going as far as to fake a Spanish accent when, according to his brother, neither one of them spoke the language at home. Frito would also bring up growing up in the streets of Los Angeles, ignoring the fact that during the time I knew him, he lived with an upper-middle-class nuclear family in a house in Moreno Valley. I don't know who he thought he was impressing with this alter ego, but everyone at work thought it was cringe. The last I saw of Frito was in the Costco food court about a month after our delivery station shut down and we had each transferred to different locations. He ignored me, of course, but chatted up my boyfriend as though he was the one Frito used to sleep with. After that, I heard through the grapevine that apparently he had been throwing up gang signs at his new warehouse and some Karen complained, and he got promoted to customer after failing to show up for his HR hearing. A few weeks later, his brother got termed for falsifying COVID tests for leave one too many times, which I brought up at my old station, but nobody believed me, so there was an additional vindication on that one. I have no idea what happened to Frito after that, but I think I can say with some confidence that he probably hasn't gotten laid again. Damn, this story ended up being longer than expected. I didn't realize there was that much buildup around these events. There's also a lot of stuff I left out either because it's explicit or depressing, but I may patch that into subsequent videos. There's a lot that went on in this time period of my life. I'm sure I have stories for days. So if you stuck around this long, thanks for listening.